Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our upcoming session discusses The Writer The Fanatic, in which Hanif Kureishi will be discussing his work with Jeet Thail. May I request Mr. Kureishi and Mr. Thail to step on the dais, please? Hanif Kureishi grew up in Kent and studied philosophy at King's College, London. His novels include The Buddha of Suburbia, which won the Whitbread Prize for Best First Novel, The Black Album, Intimacy, and Something to Tell You. His screenplays include My Beautiful Laundrette, which received an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay, Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, and The Mother. He's a commander of the Order of the British Empire, and his work has been translated into 36 languages. Mr. Kureishi, thank you for being here with us today. We also have with us Jeet Thail, who is a poet, novelist, librettist, and musician. His 4 poetry collections include These Errors Are Correct and English, and he's the editor of the Blood Axe Book of Contemporary Indian Poets. His libretto for the opera Babur in London toured internationally in 2012. He's one half of the contemporary music project Sridhar Thail, and his debut novel, Narcopolis, was shortlisted for the 2012 Man Booker Prize. Mr. Thail, thank you for being here with us today. Mr. Kureishi, may I request you to take on the discussion from here, please? Thanks.
Very pleasure. Thank you. Is this mic turned on? Yeah? Sash? Is the mic turned on? Yeah. Okay.
Can you turn this one on? Check, yes. Ooh, very loud. Real pleasure to be here. To speak with Hanif Kureishi, who needs, I think, very little introduction to an Indian audience. I think many of us first became aware of Hanif in the mid-'80s when we saw My Beautiful Laundrette. It's instructive to think that My Beautiful Laundrette appeared in 1984, which means next year it will be 40 years. And in those 40 years, there's been a very substantial body of work by Hanif. Thanks so much. I'm going to ask a question described as a general question in your new book. How old you were when you decided to be a writer, and what it meant to be a writer in England in the 60s, a time when a young man of mixed race was liable to be called a Paki on the streets.
I remember I was 14 or 15 years old. I was looking out the window. I was at school. I was so bored, I was in despair. And it suddenly occurred to me that I could be a writer. I can remember the moment, I can see it. I can see the view from the window. And as soon as I had that thought, I really cheered up. The 60s was a very exciting time in London, and it was very dull in the suburbs. But we knew that there was some excitement going on somewhere else, which was in London, which was not very far away. And we knew that there were lower middle class kids like us in bands like The Who and the Rolling Stones, the Kinks and so on, who were living much more exciting lives. And somehow, for me, to be a writer was to get away from my background. But I have to say that it hadn't occurred to me that there hadn't been any writers like me really before. That I was, in a way, the first, let's say, mixed-raced or Pakistani/Indian writer, minority writer, who had been born in Britain. So after that, once I decided to be a writer, I had to find out what kind of writer I might want to be, so I had to invent myself as a writer. And from that moment, I was, in a sense, writing The Buddha of Suburbia. So I was writing about being a Pakistani, or Paki, as we were called then, charmingly. I was writing about taking drugs. I was writing about wearing velvet trousers. I was writing about listening to Jimi Hendrix. I was writing about the fact that my father decided to become a Buddhist and was giving lectures in Orpington on Buddhism. And I had to write about the fact that even though I was a Pakistani, I wanted to be David Bowie. So I had to find a way of putting all this stuff in one book together. And so in that sense, every time you start a book, you might say you reinvent yourself or you make up some idea of who you might be by the time you finish writing this book.
Like V.S. Naipaul's father, yours too was an aspiring writer. Who were the role models you looked up to as a young writer at that time? Were there any?
Well, unusually, I read a lot when I was a young man. My son, Sachin, who's sitting down the front here, who's never been to India before, it's his second day in your country. He said to me, well, when you were a kid, you used to read books because you had nothing else to do. And it's true, actually. We didn't have anything electric, apart from what we used to call the wireless. So we used to read all the time. And the writers I loved when I was growing up were mostly American writers, you know? People like Philip Roth, Allen Ginsberg, Norman Mailer, mostly the men, Russian writers, Dostoevsky. The madder the better, actually. But also mostly writers like Kerouac, who seemed to me to be, writers for teenagers, writers about boys, writers about people who had left home, people who are on the road, people who are running. And America then, we weren't disillusioned with America then. We still believed in America. We wanted to be American. We wore American clothes, and we listened to James Brown. So really, that was what we aspired to.
You read philosophy at King's College, and one way in which this plays out in your books is the reading matter some of your characters resort to, usually for consolation. What does one do with a degree in philosophy? Does it prepare you at all for life?
You know, I hadn't had any education really until I went to university. And I read philosophy. I didn't have really any O-levels, any A-levels really. I've been a bum. I've been a failure at school. But somehow I went to the university with my father and he begged them to let me in. He just begged. He said, please let my son come here. They said, your son has got no qualifications. He said, don't worry about that. He's really clever. And in those days, you could, as they say, you could blag it, and they said, no, you can't come here. And my father went back to the university and he said, my son has got even cleverer since last time you saw him. And they let me in. And when I was at university, I was also working at the Royal Court Theatre, which was at one end of the King's Road, and at the other end of the King's Road where all the pubs where punk really started. And there was a shop called Sex that was run by a man called Malcolm McLaren, who worked with Vivienne Westwood. So these were the parameters of my youth. The Royal Court Theatre, where they were doing plays about working class people, beginning to do plays about what we became known as ethnic minorities, and at the other end, all my friends who were dressing in rubber and wearing nappies and pins. It was a great adolescence I had, actually, looking back.
Indians became aware of you first as the writer of My Beautiful Laundrette. And today that is part of Bombay University's MA syllabus. But I wonder if we could start by talking a little bit about the short stories, because they are not as well known in India. And you've been a prolific writer of them, as you can see if you look at this, the size of this book, 670 pages. What is it about the form that attracts you?
Well, I started off writing novels. Then I worked in the theatre, and then when I was working in the theatre, a guy came to me one day and asked me to write a movie, which became My Beautiful Laundrette, and I thought, listen, he's offering me £20,000. I never had so much money before, I'll write a movie. And then I had some money from the movie, and then I thought I'd write a novel, which became The Buddha of Suburbia. Then I had some money from that, and I thought I'd write some stories. So I've always moved around. I think of myself as a painter who does drawing onto some sculpture or works with wood or ceramics or whatever. For me, all forms are the same in the sense that they're involving you in telling a story and the seduction somehow of the audience. And they're all related to money. If I write a movie, I know that I'm going to make more money than I will make writing a short story. So if I write a short story, I know that I'm doing it for fun because I'll be paid nothing for it. And then I've got some money, I can write an essay, and so on. So Jeet and I and all the other writers probably that appear here, we're all perched on this fence, which on one side there is art, on the other side is commerce. So we're trying to make a living out of art. You should try it out yourself and you'll see how tricky and difficult it is. And it seems amazing to me now, I'm almost 60, that I've made my living out of this juggling act of trying to be an artist and trying to be a man who really wants to be fucking rich at the same time. I've probably achieved neither, actually.
Well, how long did it take before you could make a living and support a family from the writing?
Well, I left university in '76. My Beautiful Laundrette came out 10 years later. That was the first time really I had what they call spare money. And since then I made a living as a writer. Unfortunately, you'll find also that many of the writers that you'll see in front of you here have had the misfortune to have to become teachers. And many of us work as writing teachers. In fact, almost all the writers I know now work as writing teachers. And I think David Levitt, who I saw last night, who might be here today, I think described it as welfare for writers. Somebody asked me one day what the point of creative writing courses were, and I said, they're fantastic. It's a very good way of giving money to writers. That's why they happen.
Well, you've been teaching at Kingston University
Yeah.
you've been a writer in residence there for a long time, and now you're a professor.
Yeah.
At Kingston. Last month you were made a professor.
Yeah.
Can writing be taught? And if not, what's the point of a MFA or a PhD in creative writing?
I think even if it can't be taught, it has to be done. I mean, why not do something that's completely futile? My students all improve. After a few sessions with me, you can see them weeping, you can see the hurt in their eyes, but they become better writers. That's the price they have to pay for knowing what a distance you have to go if you really want to be a writer. But the truth is, I was taught to be a writer. I was taught to be a writer by my father. I was taught to be a writer by my editor at Faber and Faber, Walter. And I was taught to be a writer mostly by the film directors that I work with, you know? When you work on a movie, when you've got to shoot a scene, the director will say to you, look, I can't shoot this scene because this, and this reason. But if you write it like that, then I can shoot it because it's like simpler, it's cheaper, it's more direct. And you think, yes, I should have written it like that. So you begin to learn to edit your own work. You begin to see your work in terms of an audience. One of the things that my students can't really see, they can't see where the reader is. You know, I say to them, listen, on this page, you've got 7 characters coming in at once. This is going to really confuse the reader. If you think about the reader, then you can put the 7 characters, you know, you can distribute them in a way that's easier for the reader. So you're always working in relation to the reader or with films in terms of the audience. So that might be one of the things you might need to teach the reader, and one of the things you might need to learn yourself as a writer. It's interesting, actually, because everybody here I know, every single person in this room is writing a novel. If anybody is not writing a novel, please put your hand up. I'll be really, you see, there are very few people in this room who are not writing novels. All those people, I thank you because you're readers. Why do we teach writing? I teach writing because I get to talk about writing with a seriousness, probably you the same, that you don't have when you're talking to your friends. When I'm with Jeet and other writers, we don't really talk about writing, we only talk about money. And we complain about how little we're paid and how badly we're treated by festivals and by our publishers. But when you're teaching, you actually really have to think of the most important thing in the world, which for us as writers and for you, is what is the story, you know? And how does the story work? And when does it work? And how do you distribute the information in a story between the characters and the pages and the structure and the pace? And you really have to think about that seriously. And you do it, when you write, you do it instinctively. But when you're explaining it to a student, you have to really think how you might do this. So you learn yourself as you teach them about what the hell it is you're doing. I think also teaching is a kind of, it's an act of generosity. You know, I send my kids, they have tennis lessons, they have piano lessons, they have judo lessons, they go to school, they're having lessons all the damn time. And I think it's so beautiful for the teachers to be giving them knowledge. And I think I should do that. If I know anything, I should pass it on to somebody else. This is my duty, that this is my gift as well as to write. Thank you.
One of the great pleasures of this book, the short collected stories, are the punchlines, for me at least. Some very nifty punchlines in these stories. And I'm going to read just a couple because I think they push against something Hanif's stories are constantly pushing against, and it has something to do with desire. Here's one. As long as there is desire, there is a pulse. You are alive. To want is to reach beyond yourself into the world, finger by finger. Here's another. There are few creatures more despised than middle-aged men with strong desires, and desire renews itself each day, returning like a recurring illness, crying out, more life, more. Would you agree that the elemental situation in your stories is a man or a woman who wants something? And is it the playing out of that desire that sets events into motion in your stories?
Well, I was thinking about this, and when I got to India, I very briefly looked at the newspapers, and I saw that on the front pages of all the newspapers there were sexual scandals. And then I looked this was